Founded over a century ago, Boeing is one of the largest names in the modern aerospace industry, a manufacturing and design giant responsible for some of the most famous and recognizable aircraft of recent decades. And as the fourth largest defense contractor in the world, it's safe to say the business has been booming for quite some time. But things have recently taken a turn. If you've seen the dramatic headlines recently, you'd know that it would be an understatement to say that 2024 has been a terrible year for Boeing. From passenger aircraft losing parts mid-flight to whistleblowers being found dead, the aircraft manufacturer has been in constant media hot water as they desperately try to salvage their spiraling public image. But it isn't just 2024. In fact, the company has been faced with numerous scandals over the last 10 or so years related to their products and business practices. Today, we're going to bring this entire story to light from beginning to end, an ongoing tale of loose screws, grounded planes, never-ending legal battles, accusations of hiring hitmen, and astronauts getting stuck in space. In 2011, Boeing announced the creation of the 737 MAX, the fourth generation and newest edition of the 737, intended to compete with the newest aircraft being designed by its industry rival, Airbus. After its first commercial flights began in 2017, it seemed that the new plane was starting its life as a stellar financial success, and Boeing received thousands of orders for 737 MAXs for the coming years. But the aircraft's legacy was tainted forever after a deadly incident in Indonesia. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta and crashed into the Java Sea just 13 minutes after takeoff, killing all 189 on board. Though initially believed to be due to pilot error, subsequent investigations found that the cause of the crash was an onboard function called the MCAS, or Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, a flight stabilizing feature that had the ability to automatically adjust the plane's altitude. It was found that a sensor had fed the MCAS erroneous data, causing it to suddenly nosedive into the water. Even more shockingly, the same issue had actually happened already on this exact plane on its previous flight the day before. Disaster had been avoided the first time around because the pilots, suspecting some sort of hardware failure, followed a routine checklist for a runaway stabilizer that coincidentally solved the problem by turning off the bad sensor that was connected to the MCAS. Unfortunately, because Boeing hadn't told anyone about the MCAS, and because they'd omitted it from the technical documentation provided to aircrews, the pilots had no clue that this specific step is what had solved the issue on the previous flight, and therefore missed it in the checklist when the problem arose the second time around. And so, despite their best efforts to stay in the air, the MCAS pushed the plane into the sea. Following the tragedy, aviation agencies around the world issued warnings about the aircraft, and Boeing finally released training advisories for all air crews, instructing them on the proper way to handle the sensors falsely detecting a stall. Though interestingly, they still refrained from announcing the existence of the MCAS for another couple of months. After the public was made aware of its existence, the MCAS system was investigated thoroughly by the Federal Aviation Association, or FAA, and despite Boeing's reassurance that software updates and proper pilot training would prevent any further issues, the FAA made the chilling prediction that over the course of the 737 MAX's lifespan, the MCAS could cause the fleet to experience 15 fatal crashes, amounting to an estimated 3,000 casualties. However, this report was largely swept under the table, and the 737 MAX continued to operate without drastic hardware changes. But the warning should have been heeded. Just as the wave of bad Boeing press from the Indonesian crash was beginning to finally dissipate, a second tragedy struck. On March 10th, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, another 737 MAX, took off from Ethiopia's Addis Ababa airport and crashed shortly after leaving the runway, killing all 157 on board. It was quickly determined that the MCAS had been at fault once again, triggering a wave of groundings around the world, amounting to a worldwide ban on the aircraft just 4 days later, as every single country forbade them from flying. The months following the total ban were nothing short of a PR nightmare. Boeing desperately tried to defend their public image and the public perception of the MAX, but it was an uphill battle, made only worse by leaked internal emails allegedly mocking the FAA and criticizing the design of the aircraft in question. But the worst leak was a group of messages in which the former chief technical pilot allegedly confessed to knowing about the MCAS issue issues ahead of time and lying about them to regulators and federal auditors. This alleged confession was brought before Congress in late 2019 in a committee which saw Boeing's CEO, Dennis Muilenburg, deny any knowledge of the existence of these messages and reaffirm the plane's safety. Eventually, these issues were brought up as criminal fraud charges by the US Department of Justice, alleging that the company had illegally withheld information that would have otherwise prevented the plane from passing inspection. Boeing pled innocent but agreed to settle the charges and paid fines with a staggering total of $2.5 billion. The only individual to receive criminal charges from the ordeal was a pilot named Mark Faulkner, indicated by federal prosecutors who claimed he knowingly omitted critical information about the MAX to secure customers for Boeing. However, Faulkner was later found not guilty. It wasn't until 2023 that the 737 MAX had returned to full operational status around the world when China Southern Airlines became one of the final airlines to return it to service, a whole 4 years after the incident in Ethiopia. But not even another full year would go by before Boeing was embroiled in yet another controversy. In late December 2023, Boeing quietly asked airlines to inspect newer 737 MAX deliveries for potential loose screws in the rudder control systems, a request which was made public by the FAA once they learned of it. Then, just a week later in January 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 was flying over Oregon when the door plug, a sort of substitute for an optional emergency exit, was suddenly ripped off the aircraft and thrown free from the fuselage. The sudden opening of the aircraft led to a rapid, uncontrolled decompression, and a teenage boy sitting close to the opening had his shirt ripped off of him by the sheer force of the air pressure. In fact, his mother said that she had to hold on to him to prevent him from being sucked out of the plane until they could attach his seatbelt. Her quick thinking likely saved his life. The whole scene was complete pandemonium, with oxygen masks deploying throughout the cabin, the cockpit door automatically flying open, the first officer losing their headset, and everyone desperately trying to remain calm as the pilots quickly descended and returned to Portland for an emergency landing. The door plug was eventually found in a backyard in Oregon, and 2 passengers' cell phones were later found on the ground as well. In the end, thankfully, nobody had lost their lives or been seriously injured, but only because the seat directly adjacent to the emergency door had been empty. Had someone been sitting in that chair, things may have turned out very differently. Regardless, this was yet another disaster for Boeing. Investigations revealed that the door plug had come loose due to 4 missing bolts, an oversight that had somehow not been noticed by quality control. Alaska Airlines reported in their subsequent inspections that they found loose bolts on several aircraft, supported by a similar, concerning report from United Airlines. The FAA announced a new investigation into Boeing's quality control line, and every 737 MAX with a door plug was grounded worldwide for safety inspections. Still, this was a costly mistake. Across all customers, Boeing dished out more than $440 million in compensation for the groundings and announced their intention to buy back Spirit Aerosystems, the manufacturer that had been involved with the door plugs, to bring the entirety of the fuselage back under their direct control. But 2024 was only going to get worse. Fast forward to June, when Korean Air Flight KE-189 was mid-flight on a routine trip from South Korea to Taiwan when the aircraft suddenly experienced a malfunction in its pressurization system, causing the plane to go into a rapid descent, dropping more than 26,000 feet or nearly 8,000 meters in just 15 minutes. No one was killed, but 17 people had to be hospitalized after the emergency landing. And just before this, another 737 MAX flying over the US experienced what is called a Dutch roll, a flight condition in which the plane sways back and forth with high instability. The skilled pilots were able to recover from the condition and safely land, but once on the ground, it was found that some parts of the tail rudder were heavily damaged. Throughout all these back-to-back scandals, Boeing was charged once again by the US Department of Justice, who alleged that Boeing had conspired to defraud the federal government, a claim stemming from their assertion that Boeing had failed to improve safety regulations as promised after the first charges had been settled a couple of years prior. Boeing ultimately pled guilty to these felony charges and reached a plea deal in which they would pay a $487 million fine and invest a further $455 million into their safety and compliance teams over the next 3 years. And it was during this investigation that Boeing became the center of the world's attention once again, though this time for a completely new reason: the death of one of their former employees. John Mitchell Barnett had worked in quality control for more than 30 years at Boeing, with 7 of those years in management. Beginning in 2017, he'd begun to raise concerns about their QA process, filing a case with OSHA under the Whistleblower Protection Program, and had brought the case to the public in 2019 through the New York Times. Though the case was ultimately ruled in favour of Boeing, Barnett and his legal team then sued Boeing themselves, alleging that the company had undermined his career because he had raised safety concerns. However, during the court hearing in March 2024, Barnett failed to show up for the second half of his testimony, and after a couple days of absence, he was found dead in his truck, pistol in hand. The cause of the death was quickly determined to be a gunshot wound to the head, which the coroner described as self-inflicted. Officially, the police department ruled the case as a suicide by firearm, likely caused as a result of the stress Barnett was facing at the time. However, this did not stop rumours from immediately circulating online, with the internet especially jumping at the opportunity to accuse Boeing of hiring a hitman to assassinate a potential threat to the company. This sentiment was indirectly supported by Barnett's lawyer, who said, "I knew John Barnett for 7 years and never saw anything that would indicate he would take his own life." The oddest part seems to be that Barnett allegedly ended his own life without coming back to finish his testimony in court, and the flames of these assassination rumours were only fanned when a second whistleblower suddenly died just 2 months later. This from what was described as a rapidly spreading mystery infection. This second whistleblower was Joshua Dean, a quality auditor for Spirit Aerosystems. Of course, there is absolutely no concrete evidence to connect Boeing to either of these deaths or anything to clearly indicate that they were murders, but the timing of their deaths mid-trial raised more than a few eyebrows, and support for remaining whistleblowers skyrocketed amidst fears for their lives. Whether Boeing was behind the deaths or not, the media backlash from the events was extensive. But even once that had blown over, they were once again thrown into the spotlight, as it seems they just can't go a few months without something new popping up. In August 2024, NASA came out and publicly admitted that there had been a serious technical failure in space, leading to 2 astronauts, Barry Wilmore and Sunita Williams, being trapped on the International Space Station. What was supposed to essentially be a week-long trip is now looking like it will take up to 8 months, and preliminary reports indicate that they may be stuck in orbit until 2025. The root of the issue is Starliner, a space capsule designed by Boeing to fulfill NASA's transport needs to and from the ISS. NASA has been contracting private firms for these trips for quite some time now, as the last of their space shuttles was retired in 2011, and it seemed that Starliner would be perfect for the job. This would be a lucrative market to capitalize on, with their only real competition being SpaceX. But Starliner's first manned mission now has Boeing's entire program being called into question. So, for starters, back in 2019, a Starliner capsule flew an unmanned mission to the ISS just to test the waters and was unable to dock with the station. No biggie, since nobody was on board, but certainly an indicator that the programs had some bumps that needed to be smoothed out. Fast forward to June 2024, and as the 2 Starliner astronauts ascend into the sky in Boeing's first ever manned space mission, they already began noticing problems, notably a helium leak. The leak was isolated and determined to be non-problematic, so they continued the mission, but as they reached the ISS the next day, 4 more helium leaks were detected. To make matters worse, they then struggled to dock with the space station due to 5 of the craft's 28 thrusters outright failing. After finally getting on board, it was clear that Starliner couldn't be trusted with the risky return trip, as re-entry into the atmosphere requires very precise trajectories, and the astronauts were instructed to stay on board until a solution could be figured out. Now, it should be noted, the astronauts are stuck, yes, but it's not like they're stranded on a desolate island. There's plenty of food and accommodation on the ISS and 7 other astronauts, but the 2 new arrivals might be a bit uncomfortable since the pair did not bring any toiletries or personal belongings with them. These bags were left on Earth due to weight issues. That shouldn't have been a problem on an 8-day trip, but well, that didn't exactly pan out. Perhaps the most humiliating aspect for Boeing in all of this isn't the failure of the spacecraft per se, but rather that NASA's primary option at the moment is to bring them home on a routine SpaceX Dragon capsule mission in 2025, which could have 2 seats cleared to make space for them on the return trip. As Boeing's primary rival in the industry, letting SpaceX save the crew they were trusted with is a pretty big blow to business. All of these recent events are a nightmare for Boeing, from the financial hits to bad press from dead whistleblowers and near accidents in space. It's only because of their size and industry reputation that the company has managed to weather the storm thus far. But it hasn't come without a price. Not only has Boeing been ordered to pay a combined $3 billion in various damages and fines from the two criminal charges, they'd had to fork out hundreds of millions in several other places as well, including out-of-court settlements with Ethiopia Airlines and dozens of lawsuits from passengers that were aboard Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 when the door blew off. The most expensive, though, by far, were the groundings of the 737 MAXs in 2019. Estimates place the direct loss of revenue at over $20 billion, with indirect losses reaching $60 billion. In May 2024, CNN reported that Boeing has lost $32 billion since 2019, with no end to the losses in sight. The CEO has announced that he will be stepping down at the end of 2024, and with Starliner off to a historically rough start, their new business ventures in orbit may not be as profitable as they were hoping, if at all. And all this on top of controversies that have already been piling up for years. In 2011, the non-profit organisation Every Voice criticised Boeing for allegedly not paying taxes between the years 2008 and 2010, and instead spending $50 million on lobbying and getting $178 million in tax rebates, all despite making around $10 billion of profit in that time, laying off 14,000 workers and increasing their top 5 executives' paychecks by 30%. And more recently, faculty and students at dozens of universities around the US have called for their academic partnerships with Boeing to be cancelled amidst accusations of war profiteering. These allegations stem from Boeing missiles being found in Yemen, in airstrikes that many called indiscriminate, as well as Boeing being one of the biggest supporters of Israel in the current war against Hamas. All of this combined has left many wondering if Boeing can even survive, with many former employees emerging and accusing the company of prioritizing production speed over quality. There may come a point when airlines decide they can no longer trust aircraft from Boeing and refuse to order from them, which would be devastating since the company is currently banking future profits on the release of their next generation 737, scheduled to be flown sometime around the year 2030. Obviously, a corporation of such immense size won't suddenly go bankrupt and disappear overnight, reminiscent of comments along the lines of too big to fail. But what we're witnessing right now may be the beginning of a steady decline and a gradual slip into obscurity of the once legendary Boeing.